I come from Florida, and I now understand why I'm here. Does anybody know what cockroaches are called in Florida? Palmetto bugs. They're called palmetto bugs. So I am the palmetto bug in the punch bowl. You'll see why in a few minutes. I want to tell you a story to start with, and it's a Texas story, as it turns out. It was about just a couple of days after the planes started flying after September 11th. Remember, the FAA had grounded all planes, and I forget how long it was, but several days after planes started flying. So there's not a lot of people who are flying, and I'm in the Dallas airport on a connection. It's late at night, and I tend to stay to myself in situations like that, rather than engaging in conversation. And the person next to me is either an airline captain or he's a first officer, and he starts talking to me, so we get into this discussion about airline security, which was fine. It went on for a long time, and then we hit that sort of deadly silence where there was nothing else to talk about. So he says to me, "Well, what do you do?" And I said, "I'm a consultant. I've got kind of an interesting job. I do work with retirement communities and nursing homes and assisted living and home care." And I could see that he was getting anxious, and he stopped, and he turned into Clint Eastwood in Dirty Harry. And I'll do a poor impression, but this is exactly what he said. "Well, then you're going to have to do something about those nursing homes." I said, "Really? Why?" He said, "Every time I think about moving into one, I want to take a 45 to my cranium." I looked at him. He's about 45 years old, and I'm saying, there's good news. The good news, he's not flying the plane. The bad news is here's a perfect stranger who has an emotional and visceral reaction to the whole idea of a nursing home. And to be blunt about it, I don't know that he reflects the public any differently than the majority of people outside. And I sat through most of the presentations. My history in long-term care goes way back. I was a dishwasher and a cook in a nursing home for 7 years when I was much younger. And somebody said to me recently, "Really? 7 years, Scott?" And I thought to myself, I said, that was actually a much more honorable profession than my second one, which is when I practiced law as a trial lawyer. Those were good 7 years. But I think of myself today as a bit of a consumerist, and also a bit of a provocateur, and there's a reason for that. Gary Hamel is a strategist and a bit of a management guru, and you're going to see some words come up on the screen. And I want to focus on the last sentence. The 21st century change is discontinuous, it's abrupt, and it's seditious. I've said in other settings, those are really rich words, and particularly rich if we believe them. But I want to go back for a second and suggest to you that the reason why I'm here as the cockroach in the punch bowl is to get your attention. I actually want to make you uncomfortable. I've got some personal motivation for that, which I'll explain at the end. But I think as providers who have been in the field, in the business for a long time, we've got changes that are upon us that are much more significant than anyone really realizes or talks about. From 1985 to 2005, the nonprofit field lost 46% of its market share in assisted living. Now you can say, well, that's no big deal, but if you're simply about business, or you're a business strategist, you would say a loss of almost 50% of your market share is really significant. There's something else. There's another piece of data, and there's a couple of different studies on this, and there's a couple of different data sources, but the utilization of nursing homes, pick almost any age group that you might, has been declining at the rate of about 0.5% every year for the last 25 years. And in one study by the AARP, they suggested that if you age adjust, that 25% of the utilization rate of nursing homes has gone away. Now, what's happening is the aging population is taking us to a new level in terms of the number of people, so a declining utilization rate doesn't make much difference. And if you said, well, 85 to 2005, 46%, that's almost incremental, hardly a couple of percentage points each year, we wouldn't have felt it. And the fact is, it's like the old story about the frog. You can throw a frog into boiling water and he'll die, or you can keep turning the heat up on the water, and he'll die. I think that's where we are, which is that we've got a declining utilization. The public has rejected what we're offering. And the topic that I want to talk about is what do we do about it? Well, there's something else. I spent half my year in New Jersey, and I was a victim, if you want, of Hurricane Sandy. I could have been this person standing on the shoreline thinking about long-term care and post-acute care and saying, gee, it's interesting. We've got this Affordable Care Act that's changing things really dramatically and really quickly, and the President's budget message talks about the value-based payment and how quickly that's going. We could talk about bundled payment and all of those, and the $716 billion in the Affordable Care Act that has to come out of Medicare. Boy, that's significant for all of you in this room. We could talk about government debt, and we could talk about the ability of the government to pay for service through Medicare and Medicaid. I could show you financial models that we do at Clifton Larson Allen that would show the difference between what an expense increase of 3% or 2.5% may be, what the impact of that is when our revenue increases assumptions for Medicare and Medicaid aren't anywhere close to that. And those good old days of assuming 3% or 4% or 2%, I think, are gone. We call that euphemistically the net inflationary spread. And when the net inflationary spread is negative, you can take an organization that has 100 days of cash, or let's say 44 days of cash, and they'll be out of business, out of cash in about 5 years with an incremental change in the net inflationary spread. So we've got that going on. And then we have what's going on with the consumer. And the consumer is that airline pilot. The consumer is some of you in this room who I haven't talked to today, but I know you from the past in the sense that when I talk to nursing home administrators and I say, as good a place as you have, do you want to be there? And the answer many times is no. The consumer is changing dramatically. Culture change is a topic I've written about. I wrote an introduction to the second volume of a 2-volume set on culture change, and my topic was the business case for culture change. And what I found was that for those who are heavily into culture change, we're not making much use of it, other than doing the good things for residents and families that we should. That may be enough, but it's not enough when you look and you say in the for-profit field, you know, we're not adopting it at the same rate that the nonprofits are. And one of the reasons is that we've not made a good, strong case for why culture change matters from a business perspective. And I don't have the time to do that today, but it does matter. But there are those who would pronounce the death of culture change today. You can go on blogs, and some of the people who are the very leaders in the field are now pronouncing the death of culture change as a movement. And what they're not saying is, they're not suggesting that it's not the right thing to do. What they're saying is that it's not needed. And the way I would express it is, when we protested the Vietnam War in the 60s as a baby boomer, we didn't hire surrogates to do that. We didn't need the president of AARP to go out and tell us we were against the war. We did that as baby boomers. I want to spend more time on the consumer, but I need to keep moving. So I can look at all those things and say, well, the consumer's changing, I've got the Affordable Care Act, and I've got government debt, all of them impacting at one time. And in the 30-some years I've been in the consulting field in post-acute care, I've never seen anything like this. And I could put my umbrella up and say, well, it's going to rain for a while, and the wind's pretty strong, and the tide may be coming up. Or I could look at this and say, gosh, if we just raised ourselves up and we elevated our perspective, we'd realize that we're in the outer bands of a hurricane of change. I think that's where we are. Now, for those of you from the Northeast, or you were born after 1960 or 1965, these are outhouses. Why am I showing you an outhouse? The reason I'm showing you an outhouse is that it's something that a person can use if they need to, but rarely would they want to. My mother, when we used to visit Tennessee in the middle of the summer, would only stay about an hour at my great-aunt and great-uncle's houses because they didn't have indoor plumbing, and she would rush back to Union City. Now, why do I show you this? I pause for a second and say, I did a presentation in Asheville in September. A CEO came rushing up to me after the presentation. He says, I wasn't in the room, but I was getting text during the whole presentation from my CFO who was in your presentation. I was laughing at them really wide. And he says, the best one was when he wrote, Scott Townsley's offending the entire room, but they seem to be accepting it. I hope I'm not offending you. When I say the post-acute care provider facility is the outhouse, people know that they need to go there, but they don't want to go there. Well, there's one more thing, and then we'll start talking about solutions. We'll talk about, well, what do we do about this? And the last conclusion I'll reach here is that the biggest challenge is coming from the outside, not from within. I'm going to give you one example, though there are multiples of this. I mean, there are consumer products company today in the United States piloting the delivery of services at home. Consumer products company, we buy things off the shelf, they're delivering them at home, they're piloting that. You're familiar with Walmart and what's doing in terms of healthcare. You're familiar, or you should be, not with any of the folks here today sponsoring this, but there are technology providers who are selling us things right now who are becoming our competitors because they believe what they're selling is going to transform the delivery of long-term care, and it will. And they are becoming our competitors. Well, the last thing I wanted to talk about was I did the closing session at a Lincoln healthcare event last February. And my job was to go to all of the sessions and then tie it all together. Tough job. I just don't like going to all the sessions. And you know the feeling. And I had heard a representative of Walgreens, and she had talked twice. And one thing she said was, we want to be the organization that gives seniors everything they need on a daily basis. And then after that, she was in a different setting, and somebody asked her about services outside of the bricks and mortar of the Walgreens pharmacies, which are changing. And she said, oh, there the sky's the limit. So I walked up to her, and I kind of sidled up, and I said, you don't know me, which, by the way, is not a good way to start a conversation. You don't know me, but I heard you say these things, and I read off and she resisted a little bit. She says, yeah, I guess you're right. I said, okay, well, we have a lot of clients who are post-acute care providers, and here's my question for you. Should they look at Walgreens as being a great opportunity for partnering and joint delivery of services and creativity, or should they be scared of you? And her response was, they should be scared of us. You won't see that in a statement, a public statement. You won't see that in their fourth quarter reports. You won't see that, but that's what she said. Well, let's do something about it. It's clear that innovation equals growth. It's clear because there's a multiple number of writers who would suggest this, beginning with Rita Gunther McGrath, who's talked about the end of competitive advantage, and Kim and Moburn, who wrote a book called Blue Ocean Strategy, written in 2005, remains on the bestseller list of the New York Times business books today. And what they're suggesting is that whatever we're doing today is not going to fuel future growth. I asked a group of leaders in post-acute care not that long ago, tell me the biggest innovation in long-term care in 20 years. So think about that. And their answer was this. One person raised their hand and said, greenhouses. I said, okay, that's good. What else? Come on, there must be something else. And there was like silence. What else? And so he said, culture change. I said, great. Let me see if I got this right. Greenhouse Project is a 12-year-old innovation that's refined and be better. And I'm a big supporter of the Greenhouse Project, so don't get me wrong. So let's park that for a second. Now let's take your second one. Culture change is an innovation, the biggest innovation in the last 15 or 20 years. Isn't that interesting? Give people what they want, when they want it, and we call it an innovation. And the reason I bring that up to you is that we're suffering, not from dementia in this room, we're suffering as an industry, as a field, from something that's called certificate of need. When certificate of need was passed in the mid-1970s in order to save the government money, in addition to giving us a CON for our nursing facility, it came along with another piece of paper. And the other piece of paper said, you don't have to care about the consumer because we'll never put you in a market where you have to compete. Anybody know what this is? No, it's oat cereal. Why do I show you oat cereal? Because part of innovation is being able to deliver something that's unique and is branded. And there's some examples in this room today. I'll say Genesis Powerback. I'll say Brookdale Senior Living in terms of senior living solutions. And you can take what you're doing, it's unique, and you can brand it and it makes sense. If you can't, then what you're doing here is selling oat cereal. When somebody goes to the supermarket, if they're coming in the door to buy oat cereal, you can be darn well sure that they're doing it because they can buy it for less than they can buy Cheerios. You don't want to be oat cereal. You want to be Cheerios. And so that is, what are we doing that's unique? How are we sure that it's unique? And can we promote it? Two things I want to talk about here. It's a great sandcastle. It will disappear when the next high tide comes in. Sometimes we create an innovation, we create something that's unique, and we rest on our laurels thinking we're done now. In a fast-changing, fast-paced environment, which I believe that long-term care and post-acute services are, in that kind of environment, believing that one innovation is going to be sufficient for the future is a delusion. And so McGrath, who wrote the book, The End of Competitive Advantages, says you need to do two things. Number one, you need to be really good at transient advantage, creating a culture, a DNA where innovation is the norm. And when we routinely evolve, and as we evolve, we transform. The second thing she says is we got to be really good at healthy disengagement. And healthy disengagement is the idea that when a program, when a product, when a building is out of date, when a geography no longer works, we need to sell it. What's interesting about for-profits versus nonprofits is for-profits are really good at that, and nonprofits are really bad at it. They will hold on to a building and a program almost forever until the very last gasping days if they can't figure out just some other use for it. And I've not been able to figure out why it is after 30 years, but it's an interesting difference between the two. If the nonprofits ever learn healthy disengagement, they will be a much more significant factor than they are. Market share in actually all groups of facility, campus-type services, nonprofits are yielding to the for-profit, which is another interesting conversation for a different day. Last thing is think arena, not industry. If we think of ourselves as being a long-term care industry, an assisted living industry, even a post-acute senior living industry, we'll miss the fact that those people on the outside of us are looking at us as Professor Ted Levitt at Harvard said, if you want to be successful in business, you got to be the one that figures out that the consumer wants a quarter-inch hole, not the one who figures out how to refine their quarter-inch drill. And we're a lot of quarter-inch drills in this field where we're just figuring out this is what we've got and this is what we're going to deliver. The people on the outside are saying the consumer wants something different. They have needs, they have problems, they have a continuum that they need rather than a building that we own. They have services that can be delivered, but they should be delivered without regard to geography. If we get really good at thinking arena, thinking in terms of what's the problem that a person has, what's the user interested in, what's the family interested in, as opposed to we're going to give you something, we're going to sell you a product, we'll be a lot better off. And let me just pause here and say, memory care is the worst offender. We somehow think that memory care is an event. You come to us, we'll take care of you, we'll do great things. Woodstock was an event. Memory care is a progressive disease. We need to do much better in terms of recognizing it. Okay, so my last slide, it's a pig. It's a flying pig. And the reason I show you is this. Number one, the business case for change is we can either look at it as defensively, which is we're losing market share, the consumer doesn't want us, and in a certain period of time, we will be challenged to stay in business after the baby boomers hit their aging point. After that. The positive case for change is we've got a vast number of baby boomers turning 70. It's time for us to take advantage of that. Now, there's two ways you can get in trouble with this tsunami of boomers aging. And it's a little ways off, but it's still there. Two ways you can get in trouble is this. Number one, continue to think that we're a quarter-inch drill as opposed to a quarter-inch hole. And number two, start your strategy with the following conversation. We have this in terms of resources and capital capacity. We have this in terms of the people that we have available. When you do that, you will for sure limit what you're able to change, innovate, and disrupt. If you look at this and say, I want to come up with something where somebody will say to me, my gosh, Scott, that will only work when pigs fly, I will embrace you. Because you know what? If the pig never flies, but we said it out loud and we get halfway there, we've done a lot in terms of the consumer in America. We've done a lot in terms of disruptive change. We've done a lot in terms of having a consistent, successful business. I'm 60 years old. I figure that if I'm lucky, I got 20 to 25 years before I'm needing services. I'm counting on you. Thank you.